So this is a project that I've been working on for many, many years. I actually am from Morristown, New Jersey, and the one hotel in Morristown, New Jersey is the Governor Morris Inn. So I've been focused on this since childhood. Only later did I realize that it was actually named after his uncle rather than Governor Morris, because it was the governor of New Jersey was named after. Actually, the genesis of the paper, I've been thinking about this since I was in law school. My law school note was on the takings clause. And one of the things that I did when writing about the takings clause was, look at all the proposals for the Bill of Rights. And the takings clause is the one clause in the Bill of Rights that no state asked for. And it was really, I argued in the note that it was there because of Madison. And it was right about the time when Richard Epstein was writing kind of his early work on the Takings Clause and was essentially arguing that kind of the two almost texts, basic principles of the Constitution were the Takings Clause and the Contracts Clause. So knowing the history of the Takings Clause, I thought, well, what's the history of the Contracts Clause? And so I started to look at the Committee of Style and realized that the Contracts Clause had been voted down on the floor. It then reemerges in the draft of the Contracts Clause. Is never really voted on, but again, in some ways it parallels the Takings Clause in that it's not kind of a consensus clause of the Constitution. So so I've been thinking about this for more than 30 years. And the basic project is to look at Farron's, what the convention had before the Committee of Style, the clauses that go in, and the clauses that go out. The argument of the paper is that this is really Morris, and I think one of the questions that I have thought about but have not really kind of fully articulated is whether Hamilton and Wilson are in with him on this or not. But Morris produces a constitution that reflects subtle textual changes that pursue his kind of core goals. And he's also really creating essentially the Federalist playbook for the 1790s. So he's I think with Wilson, probably the strongest nationalist at the convention. So among other things, the preamble then, in combination with the necessary and proper clause, becomes the basis for assertion of national authority. He's a very strong supporter of the presidency. Again, with Wilson, probably the biggest supporter of the presidency. And in the paper, I argue that he really does two things that strengthen the presidency. One is, and actually they're linked, the vesting clause of Article 2, I argue he subtly changes to convert it from what it had been, which is really a focus on that there will be one president who will have the executive power. He shifts it from the identity, there's a big debate at the convention about, will you have one president, will you have multiple presidents? He shifts the language from the focus on there'll be one president who has executive powers to our vesting clause, which arguably provides the basis. The president has all executive powers, particularly because it's done in conjunction with the changes that he makes in Article 1 and the vesting clause there. So the vesting clause, the herein granted in Article 1, is something that he inserts. And I think he does that with the goal of essentially giving the president a broader reading of executive powers. I think Hamilton knows about this. So the Pacificus argument that Hamilton makes, he actually draws on, both the vesting clause of Article 2 and the distinction between the Article 1, Article 2 vesting clause. Very subtle. I actually don't know anybody else who kind of makes the herein granted argument early on, but I think that's the two of them are talking. And I would just say they're incredibly close friends. Hamilton and Morris, may actually have been together in plotting the Newburgh conspiracy, which was an attempt to kind of whip the revolutionary officers into a frenzy so that they would force Congress to assert a taxing authority. And at the end of his life, when Hamilton is lying dead or is about to die, the person who she sends for is Morris. And Morris then does his eulogy. So I think that they may be working together. And actually, just to back on Article 1, one of the things that I also argue is that on the preamble, he's creating the Federalist Playbook. The Federalists in the Bank, in the Sedition Act, and with respect to the repeal of the 1802 Judiciary Act, all rely on the preamble, either standing alone or in combination with the Necessary and Proper Clause as a broad grant of national power. The judiciary, he's a champion of judicial review. He speaks more at the convention than anybody else. But he speaks in favor of judicial review 3 times. Nobody else speaks that often about it. And I think he's a big defender of the judiciary. So in the paper, I talk about how he changes the law of the land language to create the basis of judicial review. Wilson, who's working on the committee, or working with the committee even though he's not a formal member, then relies on that in various points as the basis of judicial review. And the whole concept of Article 1, Article 2, Article 3 elevates the judiciary. That's Morris's creation. When it goes into the committee, it's basically all the first articles are about Article 1. So, the Article 1, Article 2, Article 3, which is so much at kind of the core of what we look at when we think about separation of powers, again, is Morris's creation. He's also, he creates text that the Federalists rely on to argue that you have to create lower federal courts. And, then the 2 other things that I talk about that are linked is kind of his view on new states and his views on slavery. So he's the member of the convention who is really the only one who's strongly against slavery. Denounces slavery. He's also the most anti-democratic member of the convention. So one of his fixations is he doesn't want the Western states to come in, both because he thinks that they're not going to be politically sophisticated, and because everybody thinks the wave of population is going to be to the south. So when they come in, it'll be more slave states. So the immediate challenge that he faces is and just on his opposition to slavery, he's the one who denounces the 3/5 clause, kind of in very violent terms, and nobody else does that. He's incredibly emotional, incredibly powerful. But his immediate concern is, if you think about the states, there are basically 7 northern states and 6 southern states. And what he's worried about is that the Senate will shift to the south. So the 2 states, so Vermont is going to come in, and Kentucky and Tennessee are going to come in. Kentucky split from Virginia, Tennessee split from North Carolina. He writes the new states clause in a way that states can't split in half. Okay, actually, Michael Paulson, who's written on this in a couple of very interesting articles. And what his goal is, he wants to keep Kentucky and Tennessee out while letting Vermont in. So it'll be 8 and 6 as opposed to 8 and 8. I think as he does this, he has this vision of creating a Federalist Playbook. So Hamilton is really not a player at the Federal Constitutional Convention, as you know. He's the one who pushes it. And if you go through the debates on the 1790s, the Federalists again and again use the text that Morris has. So they use it for the bank. They use it to say that there's an obligation to create lower federal courts. They use it to defend the Sedition Act. They use it in the Pacificus Helvidius debates to argue for a broad executive power. The one area which I haven't found anybody using his text on is the admission of Kentucky and Tennessee. They come in, nobody seems to find that constitutionally problematic until Michael Paulson realizes 200 years later that it's unconstitutional. But the basic point is that he's created ambiguity. He's not, he's created language that the Federalists can draw on, but it's not so clear that the Republicans also can't argue against the bank or against mandating lower federal courts. And that's because of where he is in the Federal Constitutional Convention. He's not going to be able to do more than create ambiguity. But this is something that people have realized from the very beginning. There's actually the other kind of genesis of this is Gallaudet in Gallatin in 1798 in a debate on the floor suggests that Wilson has changed the General Welfare Clause, converting a comma to a semicolon in order to make the General Welfare Clause a grant of almost plenary power rather than a limitation on the taxing authority, but that Roger Sherman catches it. So Morris can't go very far, he'll get caught, but he creates an alternate reading, winning back many things that he lost, but a Federalist reading of the Constitution. And so from an originalist point of view, just a couple of closing things. The Supreme Court has said in a series of cases that you dismiss the Committee of Style and Arrangement. It's just style and arrangement. So in 4 cases, it said it's almost like that we're going to go back to the rough draft as opposed to what we the people adopted. That's clearly wrong. That's clearly, kind of at odds with any kind of modern constitutional theory about the power of we the people. On the other hand, what I think he's done is he's created an alternate reading of the Constitution, which means that, for all of these critical clauses, there's no one correct originalist reading. They're competing readings throughout the 1790s. And so his goal is to create a Federalist Constitution apart from what becomes a Republican Constitution. And I think he does that extraordinarily effectively.